Production and distribution of City Club forums on ideastream are made possible by the generous support of PNC and the United Black Fund of Greater Cleveland, Incorporated.
Hello and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland, where we are devoted to conversations of consequence that help democracy thrive. I'm Dan Moulthrop, Chief Executive here and a proud member. Welcome to 2021. Today is January 8th. This is our first Friday forum of the new year, and we are once again live from the studios of our public media partner, 90.3 WCPN ideastream. Big thanks to them. It has been an unsettling week, to be sure, and while we want to acknowledge the unprecedented destruction at our nation's capital that all of us witnessed this week, there are many news organizations providing analysis and coverage, and we will no doubt take a look at the longer-term implications of all of this in the coming months. But today, we turn our attention to some of the most enduring challenges our nation faces and has faced for some time, the state of our legacy cities. Many of us noted a piece published by the New York Times last weekend and reported from Cleveland's Slavic Village neighborhood. The headline was a bit of an attention grabber. Gunfire and crashing cars in struggling neighborhoods. We're losing our grip. A year of hardship in parts of Cleveland has left many with the sense that the fabric of their communities was fraying. The piece received mixed responses locally. You might be able to summarize those responses by simply saying it was an accurate article but not terribly helpful. Nonetheless, it pointed to the urgency of the issues and challenges facing legacy cities. Cities like Cleveland, Ohio, St. Louis, Missouri, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Flint, Michigan, to name a few. And these are places plagued by generational poverty, population loss, systemic racism, and sluggish economic development over decades. So the question before us today is this: what solutions to these challenges might actually start with better land use policy? After all, land is where we live and where we work, where we interact with one another. The land we live on can determine our quality of life. And this is where the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy focuses its attention. The Lincoln Institute, whose origin story begins right here in Cleveland in 1946, they research and recommend creative approaches to land as solutions to economic, social, and environmental challenges. Their legacy cities initiative supports civic leaders, policymakers, and others working to build more equitable, sustainable, and prosperous legacy cities. The Lincoln Institute celebrates its 75th anniversary this year, and today is the first in a series of programs we're presenting with them. It's going to unfold over the coming year, looking at the challenges facing legacy cities and the solutions we can bring to those challenges. And today we're talking with Lincoln Institute President and CEO, Dr. George McCarthy. He goes by Mac McCarthy, as well as Chantel Rush. She's Managing Director of the American Cities Program for the Kresge Foundation. Ms. Rush's work advances the foundation's efforts to catalyze more effective community and economic development practice that expands opportunities for people with low incomes in American cities. So together we're going to talk about the opportunities for legacy cities to prosper and thrive through more inclusive economic development. If you have questions for our speakers, please text them to 330-541-5794. That's 330-541-5794. Or if you're on Twitter, you can tweet them at the City Club, and we'll work them into the program. Mac McCarthy of the Lincoln Institute for Land Policy, Chantel Rush of the Kresge Foundation, welcome to the City Club of Cleveland.
Well, thanks for having us.
It is great to see you both. Mac McCarthy, I want to start with you and just using the Slavic Village article as kind of a starting place. I mean, these issues of poverty, of a fraying social fabric. When you read a story like that, do you see the roots of those problems in land use policy?
Well, I see the roots of those problems in a variety of policy failures, but certainly land use policy is one of the major culprits. The need to find ways to more effectively use and manage land that's been kind of vacant and abandoned for long periods of time has been a challenge for cities all over the country, but it's a particularly vexing challenge for legacy cities where our institutions and systems for finding ways to effectively kind of reimagine the use of land has been hampered by old institutions, basically, private property laws and old kind of policies like zoning and other land use policies that require a different kind of activity and imagination than we've had to draw on for decades. But let's be real. I mean, it's not just land use policy that's the culprit here, but it's basically the abandonment of cities like Cleveland and many, many others by the state and national governments, and their willingness to stand by and watch them go into long-term decline and not really intervene for generations. What's going on in Slavic Village is just now the culmination of decades and decades of ignoring problems that have been mounting and trying to leave it to local governments or even hyper-local governments like neighborhoods as if they're able to solve the problems that they face.
There's a point that you make that was really, I think it echoes something that Chris Alvarado said on Twitter. Chris is the head of the Economic Development, or the Community Development Corporation, rather, of Slavic Village. And he said the same thing. I mean, if you don't invest, if the state and federal governments are not providing the assistance, then they're relying on on really underfunded organizations like the church that's mentioned in the article. Chantel Rush, those problems plaguing our neighborhoods here in Cleveland is not unique to Cleveland at all.
No, it's not unique to Cleveland in any way. And as Max said, we see this throughout the country in cities, some of which are legacy cities that historically were, the heartbeat of American industrialism, and other places throughout the country that were once very strong communities where people were living, working, worshiping, and now are plagued by situations where it's frankly un-American, kind of the conditions in which people are living their day to day. And I think, how land use is a part of it, certainly, because we have to think about, for every American in every city across the country, do they have access to safe, quality, affordable housing once they walk out of their front door? Is there public space that's usable for kids and people in the neighborhood? What do the commercial quarters look like? Do they actually create jobs? Do they provide opportunities for small business people? Those are the questions that are really important for us to answer if we want to build the kind of country that we all envision for our future.
Chantel Rush runs the American Cities program for the Kresge Foundation. And Chantel, I wonder if you could just describe that program briefly for us.
Sure. So we focus on expanding opportunity for people with low income. And we look at the ways of doing that through both community and economic development. And so we think a lot about, in neighborhoods, what are the institutions, whether that's government, private, nonprofit, that need to be in place to build stronger neighborhoods. We try to invest in those institutions, and we try to think through how we improve quality of life for people, and how people who live in neighborhoods that have historically been disinvested and get to have a say and get to benefit from the change in their communities.
And Mac McCarthy, I want to ask you to kind of pick up where the Lincoln Institute and its legacy cities work kind of overlaps with the work of Kresge Foundation and then also extends it.
Sure. So we work alongside Kresge and with Kresge in a lot of the same places, but we've recently launched this Legacy Cities initiative, which is really focused on building a national network of community and government leaders that can help to work together to create kind of more prosperous futures for these legacy cities. And basically it's predicated on the idea that we need to find creative ways to overcome the collective action problem by convening leaders and stakeholders, scholars, and others to facilitate the exchange of ideas, launch new research, advance new policy approaches. And it has really 4 simple goals, and they're pretty obvious, right? It's creating strong local economies, building strong human capital supports like workforce development pathways, building healthy, green, and stable neighborhoods, and establishing sustainable, fiscally sustainable, healthy local governments. And so we focus mostly right now on smaller legacy cities, not the iconic legacy cities like Cleveland or Detroit, but cities that are really between, say, 25,000 and 250,000 in population. And we've now recruited our first class of 4 cities that are part of that network, and that's Akron, Ohio, Dearborn, Michigan, Toledo, Ohio, and Trenton, New Jersey. And each one of those has proposed an initiative that they're going to use locally to try to really rebuild and revitalize their local economies based on a specific approach to what they're going to do. So, for example, in Akron, they're going to support Black-owned small businesses to build stronger ties between the businesses and the cities. Or in Dearborn, they want to strengthen the relationship between the city and the Arab American business owners, particularly those in the south side of the city. And in Toledo, they want to create a community vision around racial equity and focus on this Junction Inglewood neighborhood where they want to find a way to kind of revitalize that neighborhood. And in Trenton, they're really trying to build a community-led planning effort to rebuild East Trenton. But the idea of all of this is that these cities aren't working in a vacuum, they're not working alone, and with our help and the help of other cities, we're going to help to mobilize kind of policy responses that go beyond the scope of the individual cities, but will engage the states, the federal government, and really build kind of a self-supporting network of problem solvers around the country.
These 4 cities and the projects they're engaged in, they sound like they're highly targeted. They're not trying to solve every problem.
Well, and that's usually kind of one of the biggest problems for those of us living in legacy cities, because everybody has a vision of a golden past, and then they want to recreate all the elements that were part of the golden past of that city. And if you do everything at once, you're likely not to accomplish much at all, right? And so we really have to start and build on strength, right? We build on success, we understand, we try new things, we learn from things, we do additional things. And we know that this is a long haul challenge. It's not something you solve overnight.
Are there specific measurements and metrics, this either for both of you, this question, that those cities are looking at or ought to be looking at? George, Mac, why don't we start with you?
Well, sure. Well, obviously the specific human capital issues that everybody is looking at is, unemployment rates, poverty rates, kind of the quality of the delivery of services to those populations. And then, the basic fiscal issues, like whether or not the city is able to marshal the resources they need to make the investments and to deliver the services that will make the cities attractive to new populations. Because the long run solution is to find ways to turn around the population loss that defines all these places. And, once again, this probably comes later, but there are lots of land use metrics that one would like to look at. So, for example, the length of time it takes to effectively reuse vacant and abandoned land, the ability to acquire and clear title and then assemble and reuse vacant land for effective community purposes. These are the kinds of things that in the end, we know will be the solution for these places, because with the right kind of land use, you can actually invest in the right way to make the jobs, to make the opportunities that will improve the quality of life for all the residents.
Chantel Rush, when I'm thinking about what Mac just said, clearing title on land, this very sort of mundane kind of bureaucratic spade work that needs to be done in order to repurpose land. When land sits idle, vacant, that's part of that fraying fabric of a community.
Yes, exactly. And when you bring up the metrics that are, needed and what people need to look at, vacancy is one of those things. And it's challenging because, as Max says, there's a million metrics or measurements you could be looking at in any community. You could be looking at small business starts, workforce development, real estate development, education, health, human services provision, but you have to start somewhere. And what we find is that if you target in on one problem or initiative and you try to apply, collaborative approaches to problem solving to that problem, that builds a muscle that a community can then take and actually transfer and apply to other problems down the road.
Chantel Rush runs the American Cities program for the Kresge Foundation. George McCarthy is president and CEO of the Lincoln Institute for Land Policy. If you have questions for either of them about legacy cities, about solutions, about how land use and land use policy factors into the future of cities and solutions to the challenges we face, you can text those questions to 330-541-5794. That's 330-541-5794. If you're on Twitter, you can tweet it at the City Club, and we'll work it into the program. Chantel Rush, there's a a mayoral race that is very much in its early phase right now here in the city of Cleveland. But related to that too, cities all over the country are beginning to think about how they come out of this pandemic and what they do differently and what they should be planning for. But I want to ask you the really specific question about the Cleveland mayor's race. What do you think ought to be on the agenda for the mayoral candidates in Cleveland? And I ask that of you, thinking like, what is actually working in other cities that mayoral candidates here ought to be thinking about?
Yeah, so at the Kresge Foundation, we are a private philanthropic foundation. We primarily invest through grants and social investments, and we invest in cities throughout the country, about 213. And what we're seeing today is that, mayors have really important choices to make in terms of how they direct capital and how they allocate the city government's resources. In some cities and communities, mayors are still choosing to land just public subsidy and just public dollars equally throughout cities and every neighborhood, trying to tackle every problem at once. What we're seeing in some legacy cities that's starting to work in places like Detroit is the idea that you can actually blend private philanthropic capital with public subsidy and try to apply that in strategic and targeted ways to transform neighborhoods. An example of that is actually in Detroit right now with the Mayor's Strategic Neighborhood Fund. Mayor Duggan has raised $172 million for the Strategic Neighborhood Fund in philanthropic capital and public subsidy. And it is currently being targeted at 10 neighborhoods throughout the city of Detroit. They're taking on challenges like streetscapes, walkability, local business, affordable housing. So this idea of not let's just, take money and give everybody $2, let's actually think about how we can make more capital available and then apply it in a targeted way to communities to try to really transform, create better quality of life, and then take what's learned from those communities to more communities in the city over time.
This public-private partnership is not a new idea. I mean, in Cleveland, it's part of the story in Cleveland, right? With the mayoral tenure of George Voinovich in particular. Mac McCarthy, what do you think ought to be on the agenda for the mayoral candidates?
So one thing that I think really needs to be examined is the quality of the public systems for kind of getting the work done. And back in the days when I was on the Detroit beat for the Ford Foundation, one of the things that we were really distressed to see was the length of time it took to really process simple things like certificates of occupancy or building permits or even to chase down code violations. And we did a kind of a system analysis, and we looked, and it was astounding to see that once somebody had completed the process of reassembling a commercial space to be a restaurant, it was taking them 110 days to get a certificate of occupancy to go back into business, and that was just completely unacceptable. And so with Kresge, we actually invested in placing process people into the local government to figure out what was wrong with that process and why it was taking so long. And they were able to chase down the series of places where a COO was waiting for a signature of somebody like the fire marshal, and then find process improvements that could actually streamline the local government processes to make it possible for people to actually get things done without dying of frustration just waiting for the city to move. The other thing is, on the land use side, really finding innovative ways to begin to use all the land that's in the dominion of the Cuyahoga County Land Bank and repurpose it to assemble large tracts of land to be able to reimagine its use and make the kinds of investments that will attract new businesses, will be available for higher quality housing, for some of the substandard housing you could replace. And part of that's being done. So, for example, I was told that in Central they're talking about creating a community land trust with land that they're able to get donated by the land bank. And that community land trust is a source of permanently affordable housing that is managed on behalf of and by the community, right? So that's a really good kind of long-term solution. And those kinds of homebred solutions are things that would be very useful for our mayor to think about. And the last thing, and this is something else which is a legacy from Detroit, we were really distressed during the days before Detroit went into bankruptcy to see that routinely Detroit was leaving up to $100 million a year of public subsidy, formula money from the federal government on the table because they didn't have the civic capacity to use it. And when we tried to break down the problem, like what was going on, we realized that it was the devolution, even within the local government, of responsibility for managing relations with state and national governments on grant money. And they just couldn't comply. And they were getting dinged so many times for compliance problems that they had stopped asking for some of that money. We're talking about community development block grants, other kind of fiscal transfers that are based on population size, not on competition, right? And in Detroit, with the investment, once again, of Kresge and the Ford Foundation, we built a centralized grants management office that helped the city to manage all grants centrally and then make sure that they didn't run into any compliance problems. And within 4 years, they were using all their available funds, which was really important because $100 million is big for a city like Detroit that had, at the time, about $1 billion annual budget, right? So I don't know whether Cleveland is making full use of all of its available funds from state or national sources. It's probably worth examining, but once again, building that local capacity is a huge challenge, and it's something that needs to be done. And the public sector capacity is a necessary element to deliver the quality of life and the goods and services that make Cleveland or any other city a desirable location for others to live in, right?
So two of those three things are basic, just doing the work of city government a little better.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, and the third thing is really just sort of maximizing the county land bank, which I think most of our listeners are familiar with, but they may not realize that when you talk with other communities about the things that they can do, Cuyahoga County's land bank is one of the examples that you often use.
Cuyahoga County has, at the county level, probably, to my knowledge, the best land bank in the country. Detroit has a city-based land bank that's also pretty good, but Cuyahoga County is one of the oldest, and it's based on one of the most solid kind of land bank authorities that was written at the state level in the country. It's been a model for places all over the country, and frankly, it's been able to do. I would really, shriek to kind of imagine what Cleveland would look like without the ability of that land bank to get in there and take control of abandoned and vacant property and begin to find ways to effectively manage it. And now, this is something that can be just put on steroids and accelerated. And at a time when there's going to be lots of climate refugees looking for places to go, Cleveland looks like an awfully attractive place with lots of fresh water and in a pretty good climate, right?
It's not terrible. It's not terrible. Some
Yeah.
people don't like the winter, but that's because they're wearing the wrong clothes, I suspect. Chantel Rush, the next mayor of Cleveland, will face an era of diminished revenues because of the realities around employment and unemployment levels in the city of Cleveland, and income taxes revenues are just dropping. Should they be thinking about austerity, or should they be thinking about investment?
Well, absolutely investment. When a city is undergoing a situation where there is population loss in certain neighborhoods or in a community as a whole, there's really no choice but to try to increase quality of life, both to try to keep your current residents, but also to attract new ones, and not just residents and citizens, but businesses, all of the different kinds of institutions that are necessary for a place to thrive. I think that's one of the counterintuitive parts of city building that cities are really starting to understand. I do a lot of work in Memphis, Tennessee, and Memphis is a place that has been losing population over the years. And rather than kind of step back and try to move into austerity, the city's doing some really daring things like investing in its riverfront, investing in neighborhoods, and it's making the city a greater place to live for existing residents, and it's also making the city more attractive for people, and that's important to increase the tax base and to kind of get the revenues flowing that could actually move the city back into the black.
So in other words, you can't cut your way to prosperity.
Not in my opinion. And I think one thing that people also miss is that Part of your tool to prosperity is definitely capital. There's no way around it. It takes money and it takes investment. But I think sometimes people forget too that a lot of the things that academics study all the time about how you rebuild cities, there's money and there's investment needed, but some of the things that are needed are also kind of cheap. You find time and time again, the Boston Federal Reserve did a study looking at what made cities turn around and what cities did not turn around in New England. And what they found was that actually it was about collaboration. It was about cities having a plan, a shared goal, a leadership that actually wanted to go after those plans and after those shared goals. So certainly you have to invest, but you also need planning and you need collaboration about how to do that effectively. Just throwing money at the problem is not going to solve it. It has to be strategic. It has to be collaborative. It has to follow a plan. It has to involve community members. And if you can invest and you can do it in that way, it can make a huge difference for a city.
Chantel Rush is the managing director of the American Cities Initiative, at the Kresge Foundation. And Mac McCarthy, as we finish out this first part of our City Club Forum today, of the City Club Friday Forum, I wonder if you could just briefly tell the Lincoln Land Institute story, like how an idea born in Cleveland 75 years ago became what it is today.
Sure. So, it's important to remember that at the turn of the 20th century, Cleveland was the Silicon Valley of its day. And, one of the inventors that was sitting in Cleveland and building kind of, the elements of the Industrial Revolution was a guy named John C. Lincoln, who was really just a pure inventor. He held more than 50 different patents, and he was building things like high torque electric motors and powerful electric brakes that made streetcars possible at the turn of the 20th century. He also was an inventor of electric arc welding machinery that was, of course, a very big element in building things like the Intercontinental Railroad, right? So John Lincoln, who was a contemporary of Tom Johnson, the mayor of Cleveland at the time, fell into the company of Henry George, who was a progressive barnstorming kind of progressive. Some people call him an economist. I call him kind of a political economist who had been running around the country talking about the tragedy of the Industrial Revolution building such opulent amounts of wealth and the persistence of urban poverty and trying to address why that was. And Henry George concluded that it was a land policy problem, that we were distributing the benefits of economic growth in the wrong way, and that idle landowners were getting gigantic windfalls that they did nothing to earn, while the productive elements of society, labor and capitalists, were being taxed to actually pay for the society. And so he proposed that we actually kind of make things fairer by kind of taxing away the unearned increment of land value appreciation and use it to eradicate poverty and to fund the public sector. So John C. Lincoln liked the idea, and later on, he founded the Lincoln Foundation, which later became the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, predicated on the idea that he wanted to spread new economic thinking about how we can use things like land policy as a way to address larger societal issues like persistent poverty or other things now that didn't exist at his time, like the climate crisis. And we've been doing it for 75 years, and we're happy to still have the Lincoln Electric Company, which was founded by John C. Lincoln, at home in Euclid, Ohio, right? So it's right there in Cleveland, doing well. It's got a global footprint now, and it's been diversified and successful, and using an interesting kind of model for sharing the benefits of its own success with its own employees for a long time. So it's all a good story. Cleveland's our origin, and we love Cleveland.
Yes, we do. Your story,
Yes.
your story, and those early ideas about from Henry George about the best use or how you deal with idle land reminds me of the surface parking lot problem that plagues downtown Cleveland, and I'll just leave it there. But we are talking with Mac McCarthy. He's CEO and president of the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. It's their 75th anniversary, and this is the first in a series of programs we're doing in a year-long partnership with the Lincoln Institute. Chantel Rush is with us as well. She's the managing director of the American Cities Initiative at the Kresge Foundation. We've got a number of questions who've come in already. If you'd like to add yours to the list, we welcome that. Just text it to 330-541-5794. That's 330-541-5794. You can tweet it at the City Club, and we'll work it into the program. You're listening to the City Club Friday Forum, by the way, and I'm Dan Moulthrop. So let's jump into to the questions. I mean, it's a really brief one for you both, but not unrelated to what I just said about surface parking lots. The panelists' comments on public transit would be appreciated. Chantel Rush, starting with you. It's a very wide open question.
Thoughts on public transit. That's a dangerous query. Public transit is absolutely essential to creating a city where people are connected to jobs and neighborhoods. It benefits, folks who live in a city who don't have cars, who don't have access to cars. It benefits people who, have a car but really want to get a way around in a more environmental and economical way. It's great for businesses. It allows, workers to get around more easily. It allows clients of retailers and customers to get around more easily. Our position is that public transit is very necessary, and that it's important that there's a public transit system that connects parts of the city that have historically maybe been disinvested in and disconnected to key job corridors and to downtown.
Mac McCarthy, this is a very technical question that I hope you can explain the verbiage in here before you answer it. It's about taxation levels. Research shows split rate taxation leads to drastically less sprawl, expanding economic opportunity, and decreasing financial liabilities. Why aren't legacy cities shifting to split rate or lane value taxation instead of traditional property taxes? I have no idea what this refers to.
So this is predicated on the idea that if you tax the value of land at a higher rate than the value of the improvements, the buildings on the land, then you will motivate people to make the best use of the land, right? And so the idea is this, that if you leave land idle and the value of the land goes up and the cost of leaving it idle continues to go up over time, eventually you'll be either motivated to sell the land to someone who's going to use it, or you're going to end up paying more and more and more, right? And so, and the idea is that you want to motivate people to make the improvements. And if you tax the improvements at the same rate as you tax the land, then you've created kind of a disincentive for folks to actually build nice buildings or even densify and increase the development on land that's highly productive and in good locations. So the idea of the split rate tax is that you really tax the land value at a high multiple of the improvements. And right now we're actually working with folks in the city of Detroit to look at whether or not a split rate tax would work for Detroit and help to accelerate the reuse of vacant and abandoned property. Because the idea that lots of people, and this has certainly happened in Cleveland as well, after the housing crisis of 2009, 2010, lots of people were buying up land on speculation on the internet, properties that they're sitting on and possibly paying taxes or not paying taxes on, hoping that they'll increase in value and just sitting on them, and they're just adding blight and other kinds of problems to the neighborhoods. There's nothing right now that is preventing people from just waiting for the cities to recover. And so you want to find a way to accelerate the process through which they kind of move the land into useful, into good use. And by the way, for people living in legacy cities, it's useful to take a quick look at history and understand that in the 1970s, the cities that were really in trouble weren't Cleveland and Detroit. They were Boston and New York and Seattle and San Francisco, right? And so a city in trouble isn't always a city in trouble. And one of the cities that has made the best use of kind of a vacant property tax, and now it wasn't really a split rate property tax in the same way, was Washington, D.C., where if you leave your land vacant and unused, your property tax goes up incrementally over the years, up to, I think, 5%. And so there's a gigantic disincentive in Washington, D.C. to leave land idle. And if you've been to Washington over the last couple of decades, you notice there's not a lot of idle vacant land in Washington anymore, right?
Chantel Rush, Mac's story there is specifically about Washington, D.C. reminds me that property tax abatements have been used as economic development tools throughout legacy cities, and in particular in Cleveland. Many of them are about to expire. They've also been used in other cities to address racial inequities and as policy to undo or to respond to the impacts of historic redlining. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit more about property taxes as policy.
I mean, property taxes are like any tax, they hit different people in different groups. And so as we think about advancing equity and advancing equality, we have to think about how those taxes can be collected in a way that's most equitable. We see examples in cities around the country of property tax abatements that benefit residents who've lived in a community over periods of time, senior citizens, different economically disadvantaged groups. And it's one way to ensure that people, it's economically more easy for them to do better and to be able to move forward in a way and be more prosperous. So it is just one tool in a lot of toolkits. And I think the big thing to think about here in the lesson from that just is anytime you're making any policy, it's necessary to think about who's been disadvantaged in the past and how do we actually make that policy in a way that can benefit groups that have historically not benefited from advantages. And that's just one example. You can apply that to a million different kinds of policies, a million different kinds of fees, taxes, levies, and it's just a really consistent muscle that government needs to consistently exercise.
Well, so Dan, can
Matt,
I jump in there?
Yeah.
So there's one thing about property tax abatements and getting property tax rates right, and there's another thing about getting the valuation of properties right. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that we've seen, and this is shown up empirically in many, many places, there's a racial bias to property valuation that really, really needs to be addressed. And we need to do a much better job of getting property values accurately assessed, because the folks that actually take advantage of challenges to their property valuation tend to be people who have access to other resources like lawyers and people who can make the claims for them. And very often the valuation of properties owned by African Americans haven't even been looked at for decades. And we've seen it was played out really, really dramatically in the study that I looked at in Washington, D.C. But all over the country, we've seen racial bias in property valuation that hasn't really been addressed. And getting valuations right is probably as important, if not more important, than adjusting the tax rates, because it's the basis of fairness for taxing people according to their real value. One of the things we learned in Detroit was if we get the valuations right, Detroit went through a real crisis before the bankruptcy where almost 70% of Detroiters were not paying their property tax, because as the valuation of their property went down, they couldn't afford to pay it, and the rates kept going up. And the valuations hadn't been reassessed for years and years and years, and the valuations were just horribly inequitably distributed. And so the city went through, did a revaluation, actually reduced property rates, and they improved their tax collection markedly in just a 3-year period.
Just by making the whole thing more fair.
More fair, right.
There's a really weird set of incentives there that kind of run against each other when it comes to property valuation, because you sort of, as a homeowner, a landowner, or property owner, real estate owner, you want your investment to increase in value. And yet, as a consumer, say, or a taxpayer, you want to reduce your tax exposure by having a lower value to your asset. So it's a little bit of a confusing thing. Chantel, I want to return to the kind of racial equity filter that you mentioned earlier and ask how you would apply that to opportunity zones.
Oh, that's an interesting and good question. The opportunity zones are fundamentally a problematic piece of legislation because there's not a lot of transparency on what the investments are and who's making them. And on top of that, you have a situation where it doesn't matter what the investment is in a community, it still benefits from the tax treatment. So, you could build something that is not something a community wants or needs, or something that improves the quality of life in that community, and still get, a benefit from that. So what people are starting to think about in communities around the country is, how do we incentivize the opportunity zone tax, the credit, to be used in a way that actually benefits communities. And part of that is actually about communities and cities organizing and being clear about what kinds of development that they want in their communities, and using other tools like zoning and subsidy to incentivize that opportunity zones receive good investment, as opposed to investment that is detrimental to the community. And it's hard to do. It's hard to influence. These are large investment firms, funds, REITs, other structures that are, coming into a community, and they're not always plugged in to the city and to its constituencies, and they kind of, lack of values bias. So the question really is how communities organize themselves up front to make it clear what kind of investment they do and don't want that improves equity, and then use other tools to try to incentivize that tool to be used most effectively. But it's very hard to do, and the legislation itself doesn't actually favor that kind of organization.
McCarthy, earlier you talked about the things that cities can do, the sort of delivery of basic services, compliance with grant programs for state and federal grants. On the other side, though, what state and federal policy do you think would be most beneficial to cities that either is being done and should be done more, or isn't being done at all and ought to be done?
Well, so at the state level, it would be really, really useful for the state governments to provide easy access to low-cost funds, debt in this case, for cities. And one of the problems with a lot of the legacy cities is that their credit ratings have gotten very bad over time. I mean, whether you've gone bankrupt or you've been insolvent or you're barely solvent, the rating then makes the cost of capital really expensive. But in places like Massachusetts, they have a thing called an interceptor fund that will allow a city like New Bedford, use this for example, to use the state's credit rating for the issuance of bonds, so they can get bonds at the best rate possible. And then the state guarantees the bonds, and if the city doesn't pay off the bonds, if they do default on the bonds, then the city interrupts the flow of other state transfers to pay off the bonds on behalf of the lenders. So that's one thing on the state level. Now on the national level, I mean, it's just really high time that we confronted the problem that we have nationally, that we have never had an urban or an industrial policy that is meaningful for this country. And that's allowed us to stand by and watch not just cities, but whole regions of the country go to seed and act as if the market is the last judge of what a place needs to be and how well a place should do. And it's not true that every place in the world has suffered in the way we've suffered by allowing that kind of lack of care for our places. And I'll just give you an example. With the decline of the auto industry in the 70s and 80s, we saw Detroit go down the tubes, we saw Turin, Italy go down the tubes, but we didn't see Bavaria go down the tubes. In Bavaria, the German government, the industrialists, the trade unions, and the local governments all got together and they said, what's it going to take for us to maintain our elite status in export markets for manufactured goods? Not just cars, but lots of manufactured goods coming out of Bavaria. And what they did was, they, using the national government's industrial policy, using their ability to influence trade, concessions from labor, the right kinds of concessions from employers, they're able to work together to say, we're going to do what it takes to keep us thriving and alive. And BMW has not been struggling for the last 50 years, right? Like Ford or Chrysler or Chevy are going into bankruptcy themselves at least a couple times in that same period. So I don't know why it is that we don't kind of just bite the bullet in this country and say, we need to think about what it's going to take to work together to make sure that areas that are in decline don't continue in decline, and make the right investments, and not allow our own, industries to just jump offshore when they find that it's too expensive or too difficult to even maintain their own physical plants, and decide it's easier to set up shop in other countries in the world, right? So, but we've never done that because we've never been willing to kind of accept the fact that the market itself is not the best arbiter of what goes on for local populations or national populations for that matter.
Another question, and it's sort of surprising this term hasn't come up, Chantel Rush, but how can gentrification be reimagined to avoid displacement?
Well, gentrification means a lot of different things to a lot of people today. It's a really heated term. I think what we have to think about is, as I think the question asker alludes, is as gentrification without displacement. You can have a community become, safer, have more businesses, have richer public spaces, but it matters how that's done. And one thing that needs to happen is that it needs to be people need to think up front as neighborhoods are changing about how they're going to ensure existing residents get to benefit from that change. It's very hard when you don't own the land or own the property to dictate how change happens. But there are ways that city governments can incentivize development that is more affordable. There are ways that existing land bank properties can be redeveloped in a way that is actually beneficial to existing residents, so that they're offered to existing residents first, and or that they are, required to be affordable is another option. I think there's also, people don't pay enough attention to the social component and the power component of change in communities. So one piece is keeping, ensuring that people continue to be able to live there. But one piece is what's the character of the new businesses that are opening up? What's the character of the new public spaces? What's the character of the changes that are occurring? And how is it that people aren't psychologically displaced from their own neighborhood? So they might be able to stay there, but they can't afford to shop at the store. The neighborhood, the corridors don't feel like theirs anymore. And there's a lot of community planning that can be done. So that the businesses that are subsidized, the commercial corridor work that's done, the public space work that's done is actually things that existing residents first and foremost actually want in neighborhoods. So as things change, it's changing in a way that it's on the terms of the residents who live there. So you've got to avoid psychological displacement. You've got to ensure that people can continue to live. And then the last thing I want to touch on is power. So who sits on the neighborhood board? Who gets to be on the committees that the city is actually creating to govern change? Who's still in power? Because you can live in a place and not have access to power and access to decision making. So there's got to be a lot of really targeted thinking about how to ensure that people who've lived in these communities for a long time get to remain in power and get to have a say.
This reminds me, the way you're describing it also reminds me of the work of the National Initiative for Mixed Income Communities out of Case Western Reserve University, and Mark Joseph's that Mark Joseph leads, and that he often says that so much of it is about the programming, like what you're doing to bring people together to create the community itself, because it's not just buildings, it's people.
Yeah, there's
so
a great example.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Chantel. Sorry.
I was just going to say there's a great example actually in Seattle of a community in Chinatown that's come together, and they've said, when change is going to happen, we're in Seattle, it's a wealthy community, change is going to happen, this neighborhood's going to gentrify, but we want it to be on our terms. And so they've gone through lots of efforts to figure out what would placekeeping for the community look like. And you go there and you can see everything from the programming to the parks to even the real estate development that's being done reflects the desires of the long-term residents of that community, and it's a great case to study if you're interested in this.
The Wing Luke Museum in Seattle is part of that. The founder spoke at the City Club a couple of years ago. Mac McCarthy, you were jumping in.
Yeah, so I was going to say there's a couple of tools that are really effective bulwarks against displacement, because gentrification in general is not a bad thing if it means rising land values, a better quality of services, all that. But one is the community land trust, right? Because what it does is it conveys property into community control, and then decisions about what gets done on that land is made by the community. And that includes commercial investment as well as housing that's made permanently affordable. And then the other thing is property tax circuit breakers, which are a little bit different than abatements, which are saying that we are going to make sure that if folks who live in these areas, especially homeowners live in the areas, don't get priced out by the appreciation of their properties, right? And these circuit breakers can take a couple of forms. One is that you fix people's property tax rates, and then you accumulate the unpaid property tax rates till they decide to sell the property way down the line, and just carry it as a lien against the property. Or you just identify certain populations that you're going to say, we're going to give you this property tax break based on length of tenure, age, income levels, whatever they are, to make sure that by changing kind of the economics of the community, you don't also change the demographics by definition, right?
Different kind of question right here. Healthcare is a key economic driver in Greater Cleveland. How can Cleveland's healthcare systems work as partners for economic inclusion and development more effectively? Any advice?
Well, Cleveland's healthcare providers have been doing some of this. I mean, let's not act as if they haven't done anything, but one of the most successful things that we've seen in multiple cities, including places like Chicago and Detroit, are the employer-assisted housing programs, where you make it possible for your employees to live close to where they work by providing them financial incentives to do so, right? The Live Downtown and Live Midtown efforts in Detroit, really, I think they pulled together many millions of dollars that were given to both homeowners and renters to allow them to actually live, within walking distance or biking distance of the hospitals, which are large employers and anchored in, Midtown Detroit. Similarly, in other places. So that's one thing. The other thing is obviously to find ways to soften their campuses to make them kind of more integrated into the local community, so that they're not their own little citadels that are locked off from the community, but are actually there for the community to participate and enjoy, right? So that the open spaces, the broader spaces, and they're not surrounded by these surface parking lots. And don't get me started on surface parking lots. But the idea is that we want to find ways to make them more integrated into the community in multiple ways, and not just, like the Cleveland Clinic, a global resource that is kind of then, locked away from the rest of the community, right?
Although it is the largest employer in the state of Ohio. So they're
Absolutely.
generating a huge amount of income tax for the city of Cleveland. Chantel
and making big investments in University Circle and building housing and
And if I'm not mistaken, I think all the things that you've talked about are actually, there are programs in that that is all happening to different degrees in the city of Cleveland. Chantel.
Yeah, I would just add, hospitals and hospital systems are real estate developers. They usually own a huge amount of land, and as is the case in Cleveland. And so the question is, what filter do they bring to that real estate development, and how are they approaching that real estate development? And are they doing some of the things that we've been discussing during this meeting? One of my colleagues on our health program at the Kresge Foundation also spends a lot of time thinking about the treasuries that hospitals have and health systems have. They actually have a fair amount of capital on their balance sheet. And how are they using that capital to actually invest in better and stronger communities? One thing that I think also is often overlooked is, what is the health of residents in the city, and how can community health programs actually support? It's one of the big ironies, I would say, in most of the cities that I work in, that there are these huge hospital systems, huge health systems, and yet you have people in zip codes really nearby that are suffering with huge rates of asthma, diabetes, different issues. So the question is, how are those resources being put to use to actually improve the health of nearby residents, which actually benefits the economic outcomes in the health system as well, because you don't have people going to the emergency room, so such and so forth. So how are they being better health providers? How are they being better real estate developers? How are they using their dollars to do inclusive economic development?
So Dan, one of the things that is important about that is that, and a joint initiative of the Kresge Foundation and the Lincoln Institute is an organization called the Center for Community Investment. And one of the things that CCI has learned is that while hospitals are big landowners, they're not necessarily very effective developers. And so they have to be helped to find ways to develop the property by being introduced to effective, high quality property developers. They need to be introduced to others and to be more integrated into kind of the institutional framework of the places that they live. Because one of the things about these big institutions is that they've spent a long time sometimes at odds with their local government as opposed to integrated in. And so the idea of accelerating these investments in healthy communities, which is what one of the initiatives is called, is part of getting these hospitals to work differently with a new set of stakeholders to get to better outcomes, right?
There is indeed, correct. And there is so much more to talk about, but we are out of time, which is why I'm so glad that we have a whole year to come back and revisit some of these things. Chantel Rush is with the Kresge Foundation. George McCarthy is with the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, celebrating their 75th anniversary this year. Thank you both so much for being a part of our first City Club Friday Forum of 2021.
Thanks, Dan. It's great to see you again, Chantel.
Thank you.
Thank you also to members and sponsors, donors, and others who support our mission to create conversations of consequence that help democracy thrive. You can find out more about them and join them at cityclub.org/thank you. Hope you can join us next Friday, January 15th, for a conversation on workforce development with 3 local leaders. We're actually going to be looking at summer jobs. If you think back to your first summer job, you will remember just how important it was to shaping you into the worker that you became throughout your career. Hope you'll join us for that conversation. I'm Dan Moulthrop. We're going to get through this, I promise. Stay strong, stay healthy. Please wash your hands and keep your distance and wear a mask and get that vaccine if you can. Our forum is now adjourned.
For information on upcoming speakers or for podcasts of the City Club, go to cityclub.org.
Production and distribution of City Club forums on ideastream are made possible by the generous support of PNC and the United Black Fund of Greater Cleveland, Incorporated.